suburban eastern Australia, an environment that has, over time, evolved some extraordinarily unique groups of Homo sapiens. But today, we observe a small tribe akin to a group of meerkats that gather together atop a small mound to watch, question, and discuss the current events of their city, their country, and their world at large. Let's listen keenly and observe this group fondly known as the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove.
Welcome back, dear listener, episode 428, feeling very fresh and invigorated after a break. This is our first podcast for 2 weeks. I'm Trevor, aka the Iron Fist. With me, as always, Joe the Tech Guy. How are you, Joe?
Oh, good. Evening all.
Yes, Scott is not with us. No, it's not because his private school employer has found out his night job, but rather you might think that regional Queensland doesn't have much of a social scene, but apparently Scott does, and he's always got people visiting, particularly on Monday nights, and he's got that tonight. So he's entertaining and doing other things and isn't on board, but presumably he'll be back next week unless somebody else visits and entertains. So it's just Joe and myself, and there's people in the chat room already. Hello, Watley, and hello, John, in the chat room. So, yes, if you've got comments to make them, and we will try to incorporate them. Well, what is on the agenda tonight? A lot of topics. I finally managed to watch the Yanis Varoufakis documentary. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about RFK a little bit about Sam Harris, a Gaza update, because it's just so terrible over there that it's almost a crime not to mention what is going on, and an update. A bit about David McBride, the whistleblower, a bit about the budget briefly, how we're all being screwed by the GST carve-up, except if you're in Western Australia. Ukraine, China, world sort of geopolitics type stuff, Trump, and all sorts of things along those lines. So yeah, that's on the agenda. But first up, what are we grateful for? This is copying unashamedly from the PEP podcast, and it's just a nice way to start. Dear listener, if you don't want to listen to our carryings on about our private lives or inconsequential matters, look at your app. There are timestamps and chapters. You can scoot around and fast forward to the bits that might interest you if this bit doesn't. But, Joe, I was in Sydney for a week, and I'm grateful for, A, Sydney public transport, particularly the trains, and B, the Opal app, which is a fantastic little app that you can just say, I'm at this place and I want to go to this place, and it tells you what buses, what trains, what platform you'll arrive on, what platform you need to change to. Makes it very easy, stress-free travel.
Transport for London have something similar.
Yes.
And there's a Brisbane TransLink app.
Yeah.
It's not as
Not as good, I don't think.
No.
I had a quick look, and, there's lots of advantages to living in the leafy, upper middle class western suburbs of Brisbane. But one disadvantage is there's no train out here, so it's all bus, and you just get caught in the traffic. So anyway, I managed to avoid all the traffic in my day-to-day life. So I'm grateful for that, grateful for the public transport in Sydney. The view from the Circular Quay train station, looking out to the Sydney Harbour Bridge on a beautiful day, blue sky, it's a hell of a view. Good public transport experience I had in Sydney. And what else? There's one other thing. And the Manly Ferry. I'm grateful for the Manly Ferry. Love taking that across to Manly, going to a little pub I know on the other side and having fish and chips. It's the little things in life, Joe. You grateful for anything?
I think the Martyr IBD clinic.
Okay. What have they done for you lately?
I was due a script and the appointment system was wrong. Basically, I was going to see them the day after my injection was due. So I emailed them and had a telephone appointment the following week.
Mm.
So everything is underway and all sorted out.
Mm. This is the only podcast, dear listener, where both the co-hosts suffer from Crohn's disease, and the podcast is nothing about Crohn's disease. So there you go. Yeah. All right. John asks if it's a 3-hour pod tonight. It might be, John, given the list of topics. It's quite possible. And we're not constrained by Scott toddling off to bed early. So, Joe, you got to be up. Got any constraints? Got plenty of Coke there?
I was going to limit on the amount of rum I've got.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, let's catch up on a few things. So I've been speaking in previous weeks about the documentary about Yanis Varoufakis called In the Eye of the Storm. And big shout out to Steve, who sent me a $30 donation to cover the cost of buying it. And Steve, I went and bought it and I enjoyed every minute of it. It was fantastic. You come away from it. What a man, I reckon. He's an ubermensch, Yanis. Very, very, very intelligent, very well spoken, a good way of speaking clearly, emphatically, amazing detail of economics, but then we'll mix in sort of Greek mythology stories and anecdotes at the same time. A super engaging guy to listen to. Really good documentary about his time initially in the as a Greek foreign minister and his dealings with the German banks and how he was just gutted when his president,
Prime Minister, I think.
Yeah, caved in and caved into the demands of the German banks, and then his adventures as he then started an alternative sort of political movement in Germany. All very interesting. Highly recommend it if you are inclined.
Also interesting listening about his father.
Yes, that was interesting. His father was a rebellious character who was imprisoned under a fascist Greek government and tortured, and all he had to do was renounce communism.
Yep.
And even the communists were telling him, just renounce it and get out of there. But he refused and was tortured some more, like a super tough, resilient character, his father.
But also the comment that he said, even if our side had won, so the communists, he still have been in that concentration camp just with a different set of guards.
Yes. Yeah.
Because he refused to toe the party line.
Yes. So, with that sort of upbringing, yeah, an amazing guy, an amazing story.
And he said, with the whole negotiation against the Troika, so the IMF, the World Bank and the Euro Bank, he said, what pressure was I under compared to what my father was?
Yes. Yes.
He said, yes, it was stressful, but all I had to do was think, well, at least I'm not in a concentration camp.
Yeah. Yeah. Really good. In the chat room, Watley's grateful for his Donald Trump toilet paper. Good on you, Watley. Use it sparingly so it lasts.
I would have thought it'd be fairly thin-skinned and you'd end up getting smears on your hands.
Yeah, if it was truly Donald Trump toilet paper, it would be quite defective and unusable, wouldn't it? Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, true. That's good. Okay. Back to my list. What else have I got here? Got a lovely message from patron Paige. At the end of it, said, thanks for the grateful section. She likes that. Thank you for persisting with the Iron Fist and Velvet Glove. You provide much needed light in the gloom. Thank you, Paige. I really appreciate that comment. And earlier on in it, though, she said that she heard that I'm not much of a fan of Robert Kennedy Jr. And she wasn't sure about him, but she watched a video about him and thinks that perhaps everything else might be propaganda and maybe he's been unfairly branded as a crazy, and the video kind of swayed her to perhaps be a bit more pro RFK Jr. But well, I watched the video page. I mean, it was produced by his supporters, so of course it's going to be flattering of him, and also he's a slippery character in that he changes his message depending on the audience. So he goes on lots of different podcasts and tells people what they want to hear depending where he is. And I would highly recommend to you to go to the Sam Harris podcast, which is Making Sense, episode 325, A Few Thoughts About RFK Jr. And I think he gives a pretty good expose of RFK Jr. So what are your thoughts, Joe, on RFK Jr.? Is he...
I've been a member of the Scientific Skeptics for quite a while. And long before COVID, we were aware of him. He was an environmental lawyer. I think he still is, but he'd made a name for himself doing a lot clean water, clean air in the States, and then got involved in the misinformation around vaccines.
Yep.
And has been spreading lies, basically, around vaccines for 15, 20 years.
Particularly about mercury in some vaccines?
Thimerosal.
Right.
So if you remember any of your high school chemistry.
No.
Okay. Well, you remember salt is sodium chloride.
Yes.
Okay, so
NaCl.
salt is chlorine.
Yes. Yes.
So you're putting chlorine in your food.
Yes.
Thimerosal contains mercury in the same way that salt contains chlorine.
Right.
So it's a component, but it's harmless in that form. And so he kept on saying that thimerosal was in vaccines, which it was taken out because of concerns, not because there were any valid concerns, but to allay people's fears. Historically, it was in multi-dose vaccines because it's a preservative. And so if you're injecting multiple people, you've broken the seal. There's no guarantees that it wouldn't go off between injections. With single-dose vaccines, it was taken out. So it's in none of the children's vaccines, but he has been saying that it is in.
Yes.
And the fear was that this was causing autism.
Yes.
So they pulled it out, and strangely enough, no change in autism.
Yeah. And the Sam Harris podcast gets quite specific about what he says and when and how it's just plainly wrong. So...
and more to the point, he's been told it's been wrong by people who know considerably more, and he doesn't want to listen.
But he's running for president. He's going to get some votes. And according to the latest PEP podcast, it seems like his running will be more damaging for Biden than it will be for Trump. And also there were other polls, a recent New York Times poll or something like that, which was all bad, a lot of bad news for Biden. So it's increasingly looking like Trump is going to make it. My goodness me. What? We're going to coast through to episode 500 if that's the case. We're going to have so much. It's probably going to be American focused, but it's a bit like when...
He's said what he's going to do when he gets back in.
Yes. Which parts in particular are you thinking of?
Well, specifically, he said he's going to take vengeance on everyone.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So, yes, there'll be no shortage of material. Just if you are listening to Sam Harris' podcast, though, he's done one recently in relation to Gaza and the genocide that's going on there, and he strikes me as completely deluded about it. He's very pro-Israel. He really doesn't refer to the Palestinians as Palestinians. He just calls them Hamas. And there's almost no recognition that these thousands of kids cannot be Hamas because they're just kids. And a I just think he's in a bubble of his own on that one. And while normally, as sort of one of the modern day gurus, Sam Harris has been pretty good on most things. I think he's terrible on Gaza. So have a listen to that episode and see what you think about it. But
I've been listening to the podcast that goes along with the Yanis Varoufakis show.
Oh, yes. Yep.
And there's an episode of Gabor Mate
Yes.
and Yanis talking about Palestine.
Yes.
And it was interesting. Yanis is saying that he thinks the Holocaust is different, not necessarily in human cost,
Yep.
but the attention to detail, that this was about wiping out a people, whereas all the other genocides have much more been about land or resources or something.
Right.
Whereas the Holocaust was very much focused on a population, and it didn't matter where they were; they just wanted to kill them.
Right. Yes. Okay. Well, that's a distinction. Yep. That would be the Eye of the Storm podcast. So
Yes,
there's another one to add to your list, dear
I
listener.
have to say I've not enjoyed as much as the documentary.
True. But anyway, it's all there. So that was Sam Harris. Joe, remember we had the terrible stabbing in Bondi, but then there was that stabbing of well, is he a sheikh? No, he's not a sheikh. He's just a. What was he, like a Greek
priest.
Orthodox? Yeah, the priest.
He wasn't Orthodox. He was Maronite.
Yes, something like that. So apparently there's a story in the Sydney Morning Herald which in summary says that that priest has been accused of sexually assaulting a vulnerable young woman in 2014, and he's the director of the breakaway church that happened to purchase $12 million worth of property last year alone. So there you go.
Yeah, I
No, same
read
old
about the
story.
whole case. Yeah, absolutely. The judge had said that he'd acted in a way that wasn't fitting for a priest, I think.
He doesn't know enough priests, this judge. It's
Obviously.
perfect. It's perfectly in line with common priestly behaviour from what we've observed over 430 episodes, Joe.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. Perhaps the ideal of it. Yeah. Yeah. And Joe, last week with Scott, we were talking about whether Netanyahu was popular or not, and did a quick Google, described a paragraph from the Times of Israel saying just because Israelis back the overarching goals Netanyahu has set in Gaza doesn't mean they back him. Netanyahu's approval rating in Israel has plummeted, and polls have consistently shown that if early elections were to be held, his party would lose seats in the Knesset and his coalition would be soundly defeated, according to the Times of Israel. So I think that's the story there.
But he's been Prime Minister for an awfully long time.
Yeah. Yep. So it feels like it. Another podcast to recommend to you, dear listener. I find The Guardian disappointing these days on a lot of fronts. They're very lightweight and incorrect on a lot of things. And their treatment of Julian Assange, appalling. But occasionally they come out with some good stuff. And their podcast called Full Story by The Guardian, our latest episode has two Australian doctors talking about their experience working in Gaza. So they went over and worked for a couple of weeks in one of the hospitals, and just the chaos and just the appalling conditions that they witnessed. Worth listening to. These are things where we just have got to stop averting our eyes and ears and have to actually listen to what's going on there. And just gut-wrenching what's going over there. And so, yeah, 2 Australian doctors, have a listen to what they say about their experience in Gaza. That's called Full Story, that podcast. Now, also from The Guardian, printed version, Joe, we've got this crazy situation where instead of trucks rolling in by road with relief into Gaza, the Israelis decided that they're going to build this pier or a port and cause all aid to be funneled through onto a jetty and then into Gaza, presumably because it would be so much easier for them to inspect and control what's
From
coming
what I've
in.
read, it's actually shipped to another port in the Med where
Yep.
it's inspected, and it's then loaded on barges that go across to this American-built jetty.
Yep. Cyprus, I think it goes via. Yes.
That's it.
Yeah. And then gets onto this jetty. But that just creates an unbelievable bottleneck, and there's just not enough aid getting through. So the head of the US Agency for International Development, USAID, Samantha Power, said they're going to start using the sea route to deliver metric tons of life-saving aid. It's a pretty stupid phrase because that might be just 3 metric tons, and that's not much. Anyway, she added, the pier that opened today does not replace or substitute for land crossings into Gaza, every one of which needs to operate at maximum capacity and efficiency. Every moment that a crossing is not open, the trucks are not moving, or where aid cannot be distributed increases the terrible human cost in this conflict. In the past 2 weeks, food and fuel entering Gaza has slowed to dangerously low levels, barely 100 trucks of aid a day, far less than the 600 needed every day to address the threat of famine, this woman says, who is from USAID. So barely 100 trucks a day when they need at least 600. And
Well, hang on. They need 600 to avoid famine.
yes.
So they want more than that.
Yes. Thousands just for normal,
Yeah.
some sort of normal lifestyle. So actually in that podcast with the 2 doctors, one of the doctors was saying that this hospital was going to close down because simply did not have enough fuel to operate the generators for the hospital. And it's such a simple thing to allow enough fuel in for that, but nope. So yeah, that's that. Just a criminal element to the Israeli actions there of proposing to funnel it all through this bottleneck of a pier. What else we got? I came across this, Joe, at the last moment, was Al Jazeera obtained a copy of the Gaza ceasefire proposal that Hamas said that it had accepted. So this was a deal put forward by Egypt and Qatar, a 3-stage deal that Hamas said they accepted. The Israelis said, no, we're not accepting it. And 3 stages to it. The first stage basically involved Israel withdrawing eastwards, unhindered humanitarian aid to be let in, Israeli planes and drones to stop flying over Gaza for 10 hours a day. Actually, that was one of the other things these doctors mentioned, was the incessant noise of drones flying overhead in Gaza. Now, Hamas would release 33 captives, which would be women, the sick and male civilians aged below 19 and above 50. And as part of the deal, Israel releases 30 Palestinian prisoners for each civilian captive and 50 for each captive female soldier. So a sort of 30-to-1 ratio. But, Hamas saying, we're going to release 33 captives. And Then in stage 2, which would happen 42 days later, it would be the exchange of remaining captive Israeli men and soldiers for a sort of an unspecified number of Palestinian prisoners. So, Joe, if you were a relative of one of the captive Israelis, you would be seriously pissed and distraught and just incensed that Israel has not agreed to this deal, because it did involve the release of 30 Palestinian prisoners initially in prisoner swap deals, and the remaining ones after 42 days. So it's obviously not about returning the prisoners as far as the current Israeli government is concerned.
Well, certainly not returning them at a 30-to-1 ratio.
Yeah. Yeah. John says the US is building the port. Correct. Yeah. US military. Okay. UN vote, Joe, on admission of a new member to the United Nations, namely Palestine. And should Palestine be admitted as a new member to the United Nations? Yes votes, 143, including Australia. No votes, 9, and 25 abstaining. Let's go through the no votes in alphabetical order. Argentina, who has currently got a very right-wing crazy in charge.
No, Galtier is dead.
What's the name of the guy? Millet or something like that. He's had the chain. He had a running chainsaw operating in his campaigning. So
Yes.
he's a very pro-America, neoliberal crazy. He's just going to take that country to rack and ruin. But that's Argentina. The other no, Czechia.
Czech Republic.
Is that the Czech Republic? Is it Czechia? Czechia. What other no's have we got here? Hungary, Israel. No prizes for guessing that one.
Hungary's Orban, isn't it?
I think so. I don't know much about Hungary and what's going on there.
Fairly sure it's a very, very right-wing regime.
Yes, I think that's ringing a bell for me now that you mention that. A series of small Pacific Island type states like Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, Papua New Guinea. I think all of those have had something heavy has been leaning on them, I think. The other no, of course, would be the United States. So it was essentially the no vote for the Palestinian admission was the United States, Israel, Hungary and Argentina, and a bunch of very small states.
Actually, I wonder about the Pacific states, whether that's Christianity related.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe. Tonga is here and it doesn't have anything against them as to what they did, so can't say about that one. Vanuatu abstained. Let's do some abstentions. Albania, Austria, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Finland. What's going on there, Joe? I would have thought a progressive Finland. Fiji, there's another Pacific Island country, Pacific Ocean country that's Georgia, Germany, these are abstentions. Italy, Lithuania, Malawi, Marshall Islands, Monaco, Netherlands. I'm kind of surprised by the Scandinavian countries. I thought they might have been yeses. More abstentions. North Macedonia, Paraguay, Republic of Moldova, Romania, Sweden, Switzerland, Ukraine, United Kingdom, Vanuatu. There we go. It seems, Joe, that all of Africa and all of Asia has voted in favour of Palestine. That sort of and pretty much all of South America and Central America, Latin America, except for Argentina. That's that global South that we've been talking about as now, aligning with China and BRICS nations. So, yeah. Anyway, I think the fact that the United States voted against it was enough to make sure that they're not a full member, but they have some sort of right to be.
Security Council.
They have some right to be involved in putting forward motions and things, but aren't able to vote and be a full member. So I don't know quite the full detail on that yet. Joe, did you have any opinion on David McBride, the whistleblower, and his sentence? Did you have any initial thoughts on him?
Only what I've heard third hand, and that's mostly been he wasn't looking out for the soldiers. Oh, sorry. He was not worried about the victims. He was worried about the soldiers. And
lower range soldiers in particular.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was standing up for them, and possibly his leaks weren't in the best intention, even if they came to good outcomes.
Yes. It's complicated with him.
Yeah.
He's not the pure hero whistleblower that we would like him to be.
He's not a perfect victim.
No, he's not. It is complicated with him. So it seems that his motivation was about exposing corruption by the upper levels of the military, which was leading to the lower levels being unfairly blamed for things, more so than perhaps a desire to reveal war crimes. And at some level, it was argued that he was in fact doing the opposite in wanting to protect some soldiers from prosecution. But it is a complicated one, and so his motivations are definitely part of it. And the Judge Mossop said the intent of the material McBride disclosed was the opposite of what those stories published. He implied McBride's intention should be understood in simple terms. McBride thought he was doing the right thing for all the wrong reasons and was an undeserving hero.
But this is always not always the case, but certainly fairly often. I mean, Assange is definitely not a perfect victim.
Yes.
So I think if we allow this, they're a bad person because reasons.
Yep.
Then we silence the whistleblowers.
Yes. And in one of the articles I read, Kieran Pender from Human Rights Law Centre said, Australian whistleblower protection laws were intentionally amended to remove a good faith threshold in recognition that the focus should be on public interest. So I guess the judge is saying, in a way, it doesn't matter that there's a public interest in this case because the legislation doesn't allow for it, and was casting doubt on McBride's good faith. And what we really need is, if the person exposes something that is of public interest, which this undoubtedly was, then it probably shouldn't really matter why they did.
Yeah.
Because if it passes that public interest test, then that should be enough. And one of the reporters involved in the ABC story was sort of saying that this guy's motivation was murky. I'll read this bit here. The focus on McBride's intentionality was highlighted in March in an episode of Four Corners. Dan Oakes, one of the journalists who broke the Afghan Files story, called McBride's intent murky, mirroring Mossop's sentiment, so mirroring what the judge said. McBride was painted as someone who was attempting to cover up war crimes rather than expose them by arguing soldiers were being unfairly targeted and investigated for decisions made by leadership. So it was kind of like McBride went to the journalist with an agenda relating to military corruption. And of course the journalist saw the material and went, well, these are war crimes, and ran with that, which wasn't necessarily what McBride had in mind when he handed over the material. But in reality, it was very much undoubtedly of public interest. So we should have whistleblower laws that encourage the exposing of public interest material like that.
I think I said at the time it was obvious that these soldiers didn't act on their own.
Mm.
That there was a level of oversight from senior commanders that allowed this to go on.
Mm. Yeah.
And I don't think any of them have faced charges.
Yeah. In the John Menadue blog was an article by John Querapel, who I've quoted in the past not favourably because John is a Newcastle-based historian, theologian, social commentator. But anyway, he sometimes comes out with some good stuff and some interesting stuff. And he looked at the decision and he said the offence was the refusal to just follow orders. Quoting from the article here, the only duty a soldier has is to follow orders, whatever those orders may be. There is no higher obligation, and to think there is to be accused of the arrogance of knowing best. One must operate within the constraints of the organisation, and those that do not must know that breaching their legal obligations will be met by significant punishment. These are the words of Supreme Court Justice David Mossop in sentencing McBride. So an emphasis on a soldier just following orders and operating within the constraints of the organisation. And he makes the point, okay, I don't know if that's exactly what Mossop was saying, but there's a bit of that in there. He makes the point that that's the mindset that was the defence mounted by the Nazis facing trial in the Nuremberg Tribunal, where these guys were saying that I was just following orders. And what could I do? I was just one man in an organisation and, I just would have been shot if I didn't. So I was just following orders. And in the Nuremberg trial, it was like, well, just following orders wasn't good enough. That wasn't seen as a defence, was it, to the crimes that the Nazis were accused of. Simply say you were following orders. So an interesting concept where it's a bit dangerous to say to soldiers, no matter what, you must follow orders, and don't be so smart to think you know what's best, when really it was expected of other people in other circumstances. The genocide orders that you're following, maybe you shouldn't follow them.
I also think leaking documents to a journalist isn't thinking you know what's best. It's taking it to somebody else for a second opinion.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. In the chat room, Watley thinks, good call, Joe. Definitely Mormon in Islands. So the religious aspect of Pacific Islanders may have been a factor in their vote on the Palestinian decision. Yeah. John, on the other hand, I'm a bit torn to McBride. I do think he was a bit naive. What did he think was going to happen? Okay, so that's those comments. What else have we got on this guy? I think that's the main part about McBride. But so Rex Patrick, he's like this independent guy in South Australia, Joe, Senator.
Senator, yeah.
Yeah, doing lots of stuff with freedom of information requests. Anyway, apparently the Senate voted or tried to vote that whistleblowers are important and protections need to be enhanced as a matter of priority. And it's like, I don't know, a bit of a motherhood statement. Let's help whistleblowers, and the government and the coalition voted against it. So it was just, yeah. It's pretty. What's so hard in voting in favour of improving whistleblower protection laws to include public interest disclosure?
Well, because your guilty secrets might come out.
Yeah. It's so disappointing by this Labor government. Another thing he's been up to, Rex Patrick, so the War Memorial, Joe, gets all sorts of crazy funding from the government. And let me just try and see here. The Department of Foreign Affairs, according to Rex Patrick, tried to influence the War Memorial's history of Australia's involvement in East Timor 2 decades ago. Remember, dear listener, we've done episodes explaining how Australia bugged the meeting room the cabinet room, I think it was, of the East Timorese, so knew their negotiating position and just behaved appallingly in all sorts of ways against the poor East Timorese. And so he's asked for freedom of information material about representations that the Department of Foreign Affairs may have made to the War Memorial, trying to water down Australia's pretty poor record in East Timor. And, of course, the government is appealing the decision. So it looks like he had a win with the freedom of information, but then the Australian government has decided to appeal and hold off and hide those documents. And for God's sake, Labor government, like this was 2 decades ago. Nobody currently in your little group is going to be affected by this. Just let's get our dirty laundry out.
Can't they just wheel the papers through cabinet?
Yes, the Kevin Rudd method.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and say that, well, cabinet considered everything on that trolley over there, so it's now secret. Yeah. Joe, the budget came out. When the highlight of the budget is everyone gets $300 to cover their electricity bill, it's not much of a budget. It's my assessment. There's no big thinking in this one. I wouldn't have thought.
Well, this is the following on, I think, from the UK that did exactly the same thing last winter.
It's so pathetic. With all of the inherent problems in our budget, and this government is way too scared to tackle anything. Interesting article. Well, we've previously talked about the GST carve-up and how unfair it is to everybody now except Western Australia, who are getting an amazing deal from the GST carve-up. And there's a good little summary by Ian Macaulay where he says that in this Western Australian state budget, they've increased funding for housing, urban rail projects, capital funding for state schools, and they're going to have a leftover operating surplus of $2.6 billion. And in the last 8 years...
Gold plating the roads next.
Yeah. In the last 8 years, they've run up surpluses of 20 billion, while the other states in that period have run deficits totalling 300 billion. So in 8 years, a 20 billion surplus to Western Australia, a 300 billion deficit for the rest of the states. And it's all because there's a huge problem with the GST. And a little context. So he says, this is Ian Macaulay, compared to other federations such as US, Canada and Germany, Australia has only minor disparities in living standards between states. Joe, were you aware of big disparities in living standards in Canada and Germany in the States? Anyway.
No, I'm in the US, but...
Yeah, US certainly. And he says one reason is the Commonwealth collects about 80% of all taxes, and it provides all of the income transfer programs in terms of pensions and social security, and it distributes a big segment of funding, specifically revenue from GST, on the basis of the needs of the state governments. That's been in place since 1933 when the Grants Commission was established. And it looks at each state, it looks at what are they able to get in terms of revenue, how much do they have to spend, and traditionally states that were very large and sparsely populated therefore had greater expenses in providing infrastructure and facilities, so they would be compensated for that and get more money per head of population than a compact state such as Victoria or New South Wales. So for most of our sort of last 100 years, it's been New South Wales and Victoria subsidising the other states. So Victoria, for example, might collect for every $100, $100 that Victorians pay in GST, only $90 would come back to Victoria. The other 10 would go to a less well-off state. So this worked very well for many years. New South Wales and Victoria being good guys, having a grumble, but subsidising the others. And in fact, until 1960, Western Australia was a main beneficiary. More recently, it's been Tasmania. But things have changed. They started finding iron ore, gas and copper and lithium in Western Australia. As a result, Western Australia was getting is now taking in $10 billion a year in mineral royalties, which other states don't come close to. And so what the Grants Commission did was they looked at it and said, well, you're collecting $10 billion in mining royalties. The other states have no capacity like that to generate income. They've got all these expenses. You guys are going to get almost nothing out of the GST because you've got so much money from this mining royalties source. And that didn't please the Western Australians. They've got a lot of strategic pull because it was an important place in terms of electoral power. It's what got the Morrison government in when he won that election. And it's what got Labor in with Albanese when they managed to claw back some of the seats in Western Australia. So both sides of politics are incredibly keen to keep Western Australia happy. And what they decided to do was say that that what we'll do is, instead of looking objectively at what your income and expenses are and taking into account these things, we'll just make sure that you never get less than 70% of what you would have got if it was just on an equal per capita basis. And that's way more than Western Australia should be getting. Saul Lake described it as the worst policy decision ever. And we've got an incredibly unbalanced distribution of funds going to Western Australia. Nice little summary of it there. We've said it before, but it's worth repeating. And these are just some of the fundamental things, Joe, that are in, we've talked about negative gearing, capital gains tax, a whole range of other things. And this Labor government just fluffs around with a $300 electricity subsidy without having the balls to try and fix any of this shit.
Yeah, I think they should have done it just after they got in.
Yeah.
Because by the time of the next general election, they'll have forgotten.
Yes. Yes.
You just, voters, you offer them a shiny toy just before the election, and you get the votes in.
Yeah. Or just do what's right. What is the point of being in power if you can't exercise the power and you just have to enact whatever the Liberals were going to do anyway? What's the point of being there if you just have to be whatever the Liberals would have been anyway?
Because otherwise, if you've not been in power, you don't get that consultancy job when you leave.
Yeah. It's just, honestly, these decisions, AUKUS, it's exactly the same as if Dutton was in power. These freedom of information requests that get knocked back, Dutton would have done the same. Persecuting McBride, Dutton would have done the same.
But they're not doing nuclear.
True.
But we are going to open some coal mines.
Yes. So much of what they are doing is just, there's no difference between these parties. They're closer than any of the other parties. They should be forming coalitions when yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he makes the point here actually that Western Australia has always had a difficult relationship with the rest of Australia. So it was the last state to hold a referendum to join the Federation. And in 1933, as the Depression took hold, it held another referendum on whether it should leave the Commonwealth, and 2/3 of Western Australians voted for secession. This is in 1933.
Well, I know that for Federation, New Zealand was more likely to join than WA.
There we go. And in 1933, the British government refused to accede the request. Must have been at a time when our constitution still had enough British involvement. How did the British government refuse to accede the request anyway?
It was still a colony until the late 50s.
Yeah. Not because they respected Australia's sovereignty, but because they feared Western Australia's secession would energise separatist movements in other parts of the British Empire. That makes sense. Yeah. So that's Western Australia. Might be time to move there if you're a young person, because I can't see either party changing it. They're just going to get bucket loads of cash over the next 20 years. Joe, if you're into construction and building and engineering and infrastructure and stuff, it'll be the place to be. Yeah. Guy Rundle in Crikey had a big whinge about Labor, saying that now the
He's
party...
saying that it was refused because of French interests in WA.
What's that? Brits refused because we had...
Because WA had French interests.
The French were interested in moving into WA if they seceded. Quite possibly. That would make sense. So, okay. Was that Watley? Okay. Good on you, Watley. He's well read, Watley. Where am I? Back to this. Guy Rundle and Crikey had a whinge about Labor, saying that they're the party of asset owners, but they're purporting to represent the assetless and the poor, and therein lies a problem. So he goes on about that. In a sense, how gutless are they? For some reason, I'm on the ACL, Australian Christian Lobby, email list. Just before Mother's Day, they sent me an email encouraging me to complain about, well, she writes here, this is the lady from ACL, Michelle Pearce. I'm excited to announce ACL's new Only Two initiative, a vital campaign affirming the inherent value, meaning and complementary purpose of the two biological sexes. In our gender-confused culture, we must lovingly, yet boldly, proclaim God's intentional design. Will you join us in honouring his creation and protecting the next generation? Visit our Only Two page to get involved by purchasing merchandise, accessing resources, advocating for policies, sparking social media conversations, and more. So that was my Mother's Day message from the Australian Christian Lobby.
Years ago, back when marriage equality was happening, I signed up to leave a message for the anti-group to tell them to go fuck themselves.
Yes.
And ended up on their mailing list, which is now Binary, who are an anti-trans lobby group.
Right.
So about 2 or 3 times a week, I get an email from them railing against trans people.
Right. And you got onto the list because initially you wrote to them telling to F off and they somehow put you on the mailing list, right?
Basically, to leave a comment, you had to give an email address. So I did.
Yeah.
And then they continued to spam me.
There you go. And you're sort of enjoying just reading it. Well, not enjoying, but you're finding it interesting enough.
Archived it just for posterity.
Yeah. Queensland, Joe, is looking at changing anti-discrimination laws so that religious groups, in particular schools, can only hire on the basis of faith if it's strictly necessary as an occupational requirement. So, for example, if you're teaching religious instruction, that would be a genuine occupational requirement. So some discrimination will be allowed there. But presumably if you're teaching math, then religion is not a genuine occupational requirement. So it looks like the Queensland Labor government is going to put that in before the state election in late October. Don't hear much about these sorts of things, but it's going on. We don't hear much about it in the Courier Mail or the Courier Fail.
What a surprise.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I am surprised because it'd be something they could beat up Stephen Miles about.
Yeah. But you know what? I reckon they sense that most Queenslanders think it would be a good idea and don't want to make it an issue, probably. Maybe they think that way. I don't know. Oh, I just read, as I read that paper, I go, okay, I'm about to read the LNP newsletter. And if I take that mindset in, it never fails.
No, not even the LNP newsletter.
Yeah.
The Rupert Murdoch newsletter.
Yes.
Which is mostly aligned with them, but not necessarily.
Yes. Just the unmitigated bias that they exhibit. It's comical almost. If I see people exiting, Joe, a newsagent or walking in a shopping centre with one of those tucked under their arm, I just go, honestly, what are you doing?
Well, who's buying a newspaper in these days?
Yeah, so it's always old boomers, isn't it? Yeah. So, John says Watley has stopped showing up on my YouTube chat. Watley, you might have disappeared from the YouTube chat. But it doesn't matter, John. You can see him on the chat. Maybe Watley got banned for being a bad boy at one point. I don't know. Anyway, it's nothing we've done.
Nope.
To give my voice a rest, John Mearsheimer explaining Ukraine to Piers Morgan. I was reading something the other day where we get so much from mainstream media, aka Murdoch, ABC, and The Guardian, about the Ukrainian position in that conflict. but we very rarely get to see anything from the Russian point of view, whether you want to agree with it or not, but just what that point of view is. And anyway, just to give my voice a rest, here's a bit of Mearsheimer talking about talking to Piers Morgan, coming up here. Here we go.
You want to remember that if you look at what's happening in the conventional war, it looks like Putin's going to win, despite the fact that we've now passed this large-scale arms package for Ukraine. Putin is likely to win.
Why is that not a terrible thing for America and the West?
Because you have to prioritize the threats that you face in the world. And the fact of the matter is that what happens in Ukraine does not matter that much to the United States. I know for people like you, this is a life and death matter. The thought of any country on the planet that the West defends losing is a major defeat and has catastrophic consequences. I mean, you felt this way about us pulling out of Afghanistan. But I think that places like Afghanistan, even places like Ukraine, don't matter that much.
Actually, on that, I didn't really. I felt with Afghanistan, America should have kept a small military presence there to maintain some kind of order. And I think I was justified in saying that, given what's happened since. I thought throwing the country back to the Taliban was a catastrophic error of judgment, and it wouldn't have happened in the way it's happened if America kept a couple of thousand troops there, as it does all around the world in endless bases. So it seemed to me, having done many, many years of hard work in Afghanistan as a response to 9/11, to then simply just overnight throw everybody out and leave the country to the Taliban, particularly for women's rights, never mind anything else, I thought was an abrogation of America's duty, and the UK.
Right, but this is your worldview, which is the United States has a responsibility to be everywhere and
Not
to
everywhere,
never quit until
but they
it
should
wins.
certainly be preserving freedom and democracy. Otherwise, why self-style yourself as leader of the free world? You either are leader of the free world, and America still has, I think, half the world's military firepower, and obviously one of the biggest economies. You either are that entity, leader of the free world, or you're not. And if you are, then what comes with that is a responsibility to protect freedom and democracy when it comes under attack from totalitarian regimes, I would think.
I think if you look at the history of American foreign policy, it's very hard to make the case that our principal goal has been to protect freedom and democracy. The United States has a rich history of overthrowing democracies around the world, and we have a rich history of siding with some of the world's biggest dictators. So this idea that we're out there protecting freedom and democracy and it's our principal goal, in my opinion, doesn't mesh with reality.
There we go. So Mearsheimer, of course, is the one who's always arguing that NATO aggression and Putin warning and saying don't put NATO in Ukraine, and sort of backing up a whole bunch of US ambassadors and Ken Malik and the architects of the not Monroe Doctrine, the Marshall Plan and others, who are basically saying it's a really, really bad idea to expand eastwards and it'll eventually reach a red line. So anyway, I thought he made a good point there about when Piers Morgan said, well, they're the leader of the free world and they go around supporting democracies and that's their job. And he said, well, quite rightly, actually, lots of times they don't. They're supporting terrible dictators when it suits them. So they're inconsistent in that regard. So that was Mearsheimer.
Yeah, but they're not supporting Putin this time.
Not this time. I tell you what, if he turned on China, they would.
Yeah, maybe.
They'd be right with him straight away. Speaking of China and Russia, big meeting between them, lots of high-powered discussions. China and Russia issued a joint statement 8,000-word statement when it's translated into English, and basically saying there's we now have Russia and China explicitly stating that they're all in with each other to bring a new, equal and orderly multipolar world and the democratization of international relations, and put an end to US hegemonic behaviour. So basically a statement pretty much saying we're going to work together as closely as we can, and we're going to work with the UN, and we're going to be talking about international law, not the international rule of law that these guys talk about, but actual proper international law. And they're not going to put up with US hegemonic behaviour anymore in an 8,000-word statement, and those guys are as close as they've been possibly ever, I would have said, China and Russia. So what do you think, Joe? Thick as thieves in China and Russia? You see any reason that that's not the case?
I think it makes a very interesting show for the world. I think behind the scenes, they're miles apart.
You think Russia and China are miles apart?
Yeah.
In what way?
China has been very reticent as about supporting Russia and Ukraine.
Mm.
And
They're supplying military hardware and bits and pieces, though, aren't they? And chips, like
tiny bits.
right?
They've also got a land border that they fight over not infrequently. China and Russia.
When was the last time they fought over their land border?
It wasn't that long ago.
Right.
I can't remember.
This isn't like with the Indians where they do it with sticks. You aware of that one?
Between the Danes and Canada?
Right.
You're aware of that?
No, but I just know that there's that one with India up in some high pass, no sort of covered Alp region where they've agreed that they can fight, but they're not allowed to use weapons except for sticks and shovels and stuff. So they occasionally beat each other with that to minimise. But yeah, I haven't heard of China and Russia having a border dispute for a while. Okay.
I thought maybe the 90s.
Right. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Watley's going Sino-Russian conflict 1920s and 30s.
Yeah, I'm sure there's something more recently.
Okay. Anyway, you've essentially got, America described Russia as like a gas station or something like that, masquerading as a country. So they've got a lot of fuel and energy, which is something that China would like to have. And China can provide all the sorts of stuff that Russia might not be able to get because of sanctions. So, and intermediaries like India are happy to act as middlemen for selling stuff. So I was reading, Joe, I think India now it used to sell, 5% of petroleum products to the UK, and now it's like 50% because they're essentially just buying the Russian stuff and rebadging it and sending it off again. So these sort of sanctions just aren't working, which is a key to this whole new world that we're going with. Okay. Let me see. Oh, there was an article about a ceasefire. We reported on this, Joe, about 2 years ago when it happened, that there were discussions because Reuters reported them, and we reported what Reuters was saying about ceasefire discussions, and found this article that's got a bit more detail about it. So the German and French press are starting to talk about it. And are you aware of a German publication, Die Welt? D-I-E?
Die Welt.
Welt? So is that like one of the major
It is.
German? Okay. So what I'm reading is an English translation of an article that appeared in that publication. And Ukraine and Russia, the secret document that could have ended the war. A few weeks after the Russian invasion, there could have been a successful solution. This is evident from a draft agreement that both warring parties negotiated by the April 15th, 2022, so 2 years ago. So they've got the original document, and according to it, Kiev and Moscow largely agreed on the conditions for ending the war. Only a few points remained open. These were going to be personally negotiated by Putin and Zelensky, but that meeting never took place, and they go on to blame Boris Johnson for that. And so they say immediately after the outbreak of the war, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators began negotiating, and it was mediated by Turkish President Erdogan in Istanbul, and they drafted an agreement. Basic principles were that Ukraine would commit permanently to neutrality, meaning it would never be a member of NATO, but Kiev could be a member of the EU. In return, Russia assured it would not attack the Ukraine again. And to ensure Kiev could be confident of this, Moscow would allow Ukraine to enter into security agreements with the USA, the UK, France, China, and Russia, France and China, basically providing a security guarantee saying if we, Russia, invade you, Ukraine, you can have an agreement with these countries to fight back, like a kind of a NATO-like agreement if we invade you. That was to try and give some comfort to the Ukrainians that the Russians wouldn't invade again. And basically, Russia was going to keep the Donbass regions it had already captured, the Crimea it had already captured, and that was kind of a lot of the nuts and bolts of it. Was they'd stop with
a huge amount of disarmament.
Oh yes, sorry, good point. Yes, let's get to that as well. Let me get to that. So, yes, as part of it as well, it was Russia insisting on Ukrainian demilitarization. So, Moscow demanded that Kiev reduce its army to 85,000 soldiers. It was currently at 1 million. Ukraine offered a troop strength of 250. So, the ideas also differed on the number of military equipment. Russia demanded the number of tanks, this is Ukrainian tanks, be reduced to 342, while Kiev wanted to keep up to 800. Ukraine wanted to reduce the number of armoured vehicles to 2,400, while Russia demanded only 1,029. Same with artillery pieces. Moscow proposed 519, Kiev 1,900. For multiple rocket launches, Kiev wanted 600. With a range of 280 kilometres, Russia's vision was 96. So quite detailed stuff, Joe, about number of men, number of tanks.
What I'm hearing is you have less weapons.
Yep.
You're not allowed any foreign troops on your soil.
Mm.
So Russia's aim is we invade, take the whole of Ukraine before the other countries can come and fight us out.
I don't know the timing of this, but it seemed like Ukraine was up for a lot of this stuff. Like they're negotiating these numbers with them, like they're talking significant numbers.
Biding for time.
Yeah, or biding for time, but It doesn't seem that way because according to this article by this respected German publication, Joe, would that be fair enough?
Yeah.
After more than 2 years of war, the deal seems advantageous in retrospect. Quote, "That was the best deal we could have had," said a member of the then Ukrainian negotiating delegation to Welt am Sonntag. What's that,
The world
Joe?
on Sunday.
Oh, thank you. Ukraine has been on the defensive for months, suffering heavy losses. In hindsight, Ukraine was in a stronger negotiating position then than it is now. And it goes on to blame sort of Boris Johnson for not for sort of kiboshing the idea along the way. So it seems like 2 years ago, get rid of a lot of your army. We'll keep the Donbass we've already got. We'll keep the Crimea we've got. You don't join NATO, but you can strike deals with these major parties about them being involved if we decide to invade you. And Joe, Zelensky should have said yes to that, in my opinion. But I know we disagree on that one. Yeah. What else have we got here?
Well, peace in our time.
Yes. There's just tens of thousands of men have been killed unnecessarily for no gain. They're not going to get that territory back. They're just going to lose even more. So, what else have I got here? What are we up to? 9:17. Look at my list. We're about halfway through it. And I'm inclined to keep a lot of it for next week.
Okay.
Is there any one in particular that I want to do here?
Are there any you're saving for Scott?
Yes.
Okay.
My democracy ones and China ones,
Right.
I'll save for Scott. Yes, good point. And economic zones. Next week, we're going to talk about that Australian helicopter that was supposedly, Joe, conducting
Yes.
legitimately, according to Australia, it was involved in...
Freedom of navigation.
Yes, but more importantly, it was involved in making sure that North Korea was not breaching its sanctions. Remembering North Korea is not allowed to import a lot of stuff. So supposedly, according to the Australian government, the helicopter was involved in sort of regulating and making sure that the North Koreans were not transporting illegal stuff across the ocean. The strange thing is, dear listener, normally if you would be, transporting contraband of any substantive sort, you'd be doing it in a ship that's on top of the ocean. And the helicopters that we were using, well, why would you be using a helicopter? You would be using a ship to intercept another ship. And
Well, a helicopter's got a greater line of sight.
And it just so happened that these helicopters are also equipped with anti-submarine detection stuff that they're custom designed to have. And it could well have been the case that Australia was actually dropping sonar buoys for submarine detection with the helicopters. It's probably more plausible than conducting sanction enforcing action against North Koreans. And anyway, that will be a topic for next week. Right. John says the fact is Russia invaded. Yes, they did, but you got to get an end to it somehow. Still sounds like a bad idea for Ukraine. Say that to the mothers of the 10,000 men who have died between that time and now, John, and their wives and their children and their siblings, and see what they think about that. All right. Well, that'll do for one episode. We'll be back probably with Scott next week, provided he's not on some other social engagement. We'll talk to you then. Bye for now.
Do svidania.
What does that mean?
Goodbye.
Bloody show off, you and your